The VCSE Barometer survey. The sector's regular temperature check. Informed by VCSE organisations for VCSE organisations nationwide. Unlock insights for impact.
So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the presentation and our discussion today. We're really delighted you all to be able to join us. I'm going to start by sharing just a slide. Hopefully you've got that there, where we'll just talk through our session today. So I'm Daniel King, I'm Professor of Organisational Studies at Nottingham Trent University. And we've got Jack and Ingrid on the call as well, who are going to be going through sort of some findings and some insights as well. And what we're aiming for these sort of sessions is that it's to present the latest findings we've had from the barometer. So we have the core questions and really the trends that are going on in the sector. We have our topical questions, which we're focusing on well-being, and then what we're really interested as well is thinking through, well, what do you do about some of the issues that have come up as well. So we're delighted to have Ingrid from the What Works Centre for Wellbeing with us, who's going to be talking around those things, and just to also credit and thank the What Works Centre for Wellbeing for being involved in the design of the topical questions as well, and we can talk through some of that as we go through. What we're going to do is talk through the sort of key findings and ideas from that. So I'll take down my slide to allow Jack, who I'm going to hand over to first, to talk through the sort of overall headlines, and I'll talk through some of the well-being questions. For those of you who are on the call, not watching this on recording, please feel free to raise a hand, which you can do in on Teams, which is at the top of your screen, or also put comments in the chat. We would like to make this interactive as possible as well. But Jack, over to you.
Yes, I'm not on mute anymore. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Dan. Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Jack. I'm research and policy analyst at Pro Bono Economics. We work closely with the team at Nottingham Trent University to design and then analyse the barometer survey. I guess the first thing to say is thank you to everyone. Everyone who has contributed, completed, responded to, click the buttons on the survey is incredibly helpful for us, and we're really appreciative of everyone's time. What I'm going to do is spend hopefully no more than 5 minutes just going through what we found in the most recent survey. I'm just trying to work out my screen sharing because I can't get my notes up for some reason. So we'll see how that goes. Excuse me, I've also got a little bit of a cold, so I'm a bit croaky. But yeah, first of all, just to say, Pro Bono Economics, we are a charity. We are a charity that helps other charities predominantly. We have a team of economists who work with charities to help them to measure and identify their impact. We also have a team of researchers, of which I am one, who looks at the sort of bigger picture of charities and the charity sector in general. So yeah, we do a lot of work in this space, and we're really grateful to our partnership with Nottingham Trent University, and for our and yeah, as I say, for everyone who has taken time to fill out the survey. What I'm going to firstly do is just essentially, it's a year since we started, or almost a year since we started the barometer survey. And so what I'm going to do today is just sort of reflect a little bit on what we've learned from the barometer survey over that year, and in particular explore how things are looking now compared to how they did towards sort of the end of last year. But I think to do that, obviously, it's important for us to just sort of remind ourselves, although we may not wish to be reminded so much, of the situation that the country, people found themselves in sort of this time last year. So Yeah, so when we did the survey in November last year, what was the scene? What was the context in which that survey was undertaken? So first of all, obviously it was fairly dramatic from the sort of political soap opera side. We had I counted this up. There was 3 prime ministers and 4 chancellors of the Exchequer since July. So within a 4 or 5 month period, we'd had 3 prime ministers and 4 chancellors. Obviously, the mini budget, Chancellor Kwarteng's mini budget in September, played a big role in that political instability. But there's also sort of the economic impact as well. So big sort of meltdown in the bond markets, and a lot of mortgage providers were essentially pulling mortgages from the market because they were expecting a big jump in interest rates, and that duly came. So there was a big increase in interest rates early November, which was actually the biggest single rise in interest rates since the late 80s. Inflation obviously hit a 40-year high in October, and by November, the Office for Budget Responsibility was forecasting that the next 2 years we'd see the biggest fall in living standards since records began in the 1950s. So that was the sort of context. Obviously, big part of that was being driven by energy prices and inflation. Excuse me. So that was the context in which we undertook our first survey. And actually, what we've found a year later is that there's not really been a huge, from the demand perspective, there's not really been a huge change in what we are hearing from charities about demand. So, yeah, this is one of the clearest indications of the impact of the cost of living crisis. Was how increased levels of need were leading to rising demand for charity services. This chart actually shows what percentage of small, medium and large charities that responded to the survey in November last year and in September this year, what proportion of them told us that demand had increased in the previous 3 months. So the light blue bars going to the right, they show what percentage told us that demand had increased. And the darker blue bars going to the left show us the proportion that told us that demand had decreased in the 3 months prior to them completing the survey. And the pink dots there, that's just the net balance. So what's the difference between those two totals, the increased and the decreased? So as you can see, November 22, charities are overwhelmingly saying that demand had been increasing. And this hasn't really changed significantly, I would say. So by September, we're still seeing charities saying actually demand is rising. And this is actually despite, inflation, the rate of inflation slowing throughout the year, and wages actually rising in real terms for the first time in almost 2 years. So we're not really seeing those slight improvements to the economy not really filtering through so far in what we're seeing in the barometer survey. What we have been able to observe, though, around demand is there is a slight increase in confidence when it comes to charities saying that they're going to be able to cope with the demand that they're facing. So this chart shows the change in the percentage of charities who told us that they expected to meet demand over the next 3 months. So the blue dots represent the results in November 22, and the pink dots are the findings from September 2023. So as you can see, the results indicate that among charities of all sizes, really, there's a slight increase in the proportion who feel that they are able to meet demand in the short term. But crucial here, I think, just to reflect on the overall picture, this is still pretty alarming, I would say. We're only seeing around half of medium and large charities and 2/3 of small charities actually saying that they're going to be able to, they expect to be able to meet demand for their services in the next 3 months. I think we think part of the reason that charities are slightly more confident about being able to meet demand is that capacity has grown within the sector. We found through every single survey that we've done over the last year is that more charities are reporting that the size of their paid workforce has increased as opposed to decreased in the 3 months prior to taking the survey. So as you can see in this chart, the columns that are above the axis are consistently larger than the slightly more faded columns that are below it. So the columns above the axis are the proportion of charities who said their workforce had increased in the previous 3 months. And the columns that go below the axis are the proportion of charities who said that their workforce had decreased in size in the previous 3 months. And even, across large, medium and small charities, we're seeing on average, or more likely, that charities are seeing their workforces grow. And this is actually borne out with some other data we've looked at. So we've some survey data from the Bank of England, which has indicated that there's been workforce growth has been fairly strong in 2023 in the sector, in particularly in more recent months. But also there's been an improvement in labour market conditions. So actually we're seeing generally that employers are saying we're finding it a bit easier to recruit at the moment than we were maybe sort of a year ago or so. Just moving on to finances, I suppose. So another major difference between now and last November we found in the survey has been a slight improvement in the financial outlook for many charities, which I would now characterise as being concerning rather than catastrophic. So in November, I would say the financial outlook was fairly catastrophic. Now I would have sort of ratchet that down a little bit to just saying it's pretty concerning. We're still finding in general charities are more likely to tell us that their financial position has deteriorated rather than improved in the 3 months prior to the survey, but the results are less extreme. We think there's been but what we have definitely seen is a fairly dramatic improvement in the short-term financial outlook for many charities since November last year. So the blue dots on here represent the proportion of charities who in November 22 said they expected their financial position to deteriorate over the next 3 months. And the pink dots show the proportion who said the same in September. So as you can see, for charities of all sizes, there's been a fairly big leftward movement there, indicating that the percentage expecting a financial deterioration has reduced, and it's a fairly substantial fall. So we're down to less than 1/3 of charities, which is down from almost 6 in 10 in November last year. Just over a quarter of media-sized charities, down from around 45%. But interestingly, a sort of noticeably less dramatic improvement for small charities. And just to move on to my sort of the final data point to make here is around sort of another issue that we're sort of seeing, and a sort of growing issue, and one that again is very pertinent for smaller charities in particular. And this is on focusing on the sort of the growth in concerns around volunteer recruitment. So this is very similar to the previous one. It's about the change between November and September, November last year and September this year. But this is about the proportion of charities who said that they were concerned, or that volunteer recruitment was one of the main concerns for their organisation. As you can see, the proportion of charities identifying that volunteer recruitment is a main concern for them has risen across the board since last November. Unsurprisingly, most pressing for small charities. But actually, what I think is really quite powerful is that that's almost 60% of small charities saying volunteer recruitment is a main concern for us. Actually is up there with income. But income is always the #1 concern for all charities across all sizes. But actually, it's almost as big volunteer recruitment is almost as pressing a concern as income for small charities, which I think just sort of goes to say something about the scale of the issue there. And finally, just going to summarise then. So growing demand remains as widespread as it did last November. Charities slightly more confident in their ability to meet need, but overall the sector is still under significant pressure. Various data indicates that capacity in terms of paid workforce has grown consistently throughout the year. And while it's still worrying, the financial outlook is less catastrophic than it was last November, but small charities seeing the least improvement. And again, most prevalent here for small charities, but concerns around volunteer recruitment are on the rise and have been on the rise for the last year or so. That's it from me. Apologies, I had a bit of a issue with my tech there, so hopefully that's all come across okay for everybody. And I'll hand over to Dan, I think, who's going to take on the well-being stuff.
Yeah, so so again, as Jack, just to echo what Jack was saying, thank you very much for everybody for participating in this. So I'm going to just talk through some of the wellbeing themes. So this was our topical guide for those of you that aware of how the barometer works, we ask the same set of core questions every time to get the sort of analysis that Jack has just given, and then we have topical questions as well to try to bring out. And one of the key issues was well-being that we were focusing on in the last one. So I'm just apologies for looking away from my screen, but that's because that's where these slides are for me then. So you'll see that 6 out of 10 organisations said that well-being formed a key part of their objective. So we can see that actually it's a really important aspect for organisations across the sector. Interestingly though, that was less prevalent in smaller organisations. Didn't feel that that was one of the core parts of their objectives. Half of all organisations said that the improving measurement skills would help them understand well-being impact. So that I think is really interesting in terms of just understanding some of the ways in which organisations' capacity, and again there may be some aspects there around size. Almost half organisations said they didn't have enough resources to support or to measure volunteer well-being. So we know volunteering is said to be a key a good outcome in terms of well-being and got good determinants for that, but actually lots of organisations really struggle to support that and to be able to measure that as well. We saw lots of organisations are doing things to try to increase well-being. Flexible working is one such thing, but so that's something that'd be quite interesting to see in discussion. And then some concerning trends around organisations reporting that burnout and leavism of paid staff, and particularly the cost of living crisis. And of course, there are some challenges for organisations in terms of costs and other such things. So there's some of the key highlights there. So just to get into some of the detail, we said that 6 out of 10 organisations, actually 64%, said that well-being is a primary or secondary objective, and you can see quite a large percentage there said it was primary, and more so even than that. So that's 33% said that it was one of several objectives. So you can see for many organisations, then that is one of the central things that they exist for, and one of their central sort of purposes. But if you look at that across size, then you can see that actually larger organisations, that's really quite a prevalent part of what they do, and it does shrink a bit by size. So you can see some interesting trends there in terms of by size of organisation. One of the things then that we were particularly interested in, and I know Ingrid's done work within this for the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, about what are the ways that organisations try to measure well-being. And one of the approaches whether people are using informal methods to measure well-being or more formal evaluation sort of methods, and we can see that quite a lot of organisations are capturing this through informal mechanisms, but a quite large percentage, almost half, are using some sort of formal evaluation framework as well. So it shows there is some, but we're not saying that some things are better than others necessarily, but obviously when people are looking at funding or trying to measure this, then there are sort of more developed processes towards this. Very few, however, use economic evaluation, but quite a few, but there is a reasonable number there that use evidence-based services as part of that. So it's quite interesting there about the capacity of organisations to measure and what sort of aspects they use to capture that. So organisations that position wellbeing as a core objective are more likely to formally measure wellbeing as well. So I suppose that is, one sense, isn't surprising that those organisations that say this is a central objective have got sort of more formal evaluation in there. So you can see that's up to 60%, whereas those organisations that it's not a primary objective don't have that sort of mechanism. So you do expect that. Although it's quite interesting if organisations that is a primary or secondary objective that they don't have formal evaluation mechanisms as well. So it does show again the variability across the sector in terms of how that is done. And again, evidence-based ones, which we said were quite low, but actually in terms of when organisations had as a primary objective, that's up higher again there. Half organisations reported that they were better understand well-being impact if they could improve skills to measure well-being before and after service use. So it's intriguing in this, I think, around organizations that, around whether they've got the right type of skills and the resources in order to measure well-being. And I think quite a few people on this call are perhaps from infrastructure organizations, or so I think that's quite interesting about what type of support organizations need in order to develop their capacity to undertake that sort of impact evaluation aspects. Thinking about that in terms of size as well, then just gives a further breakdown that you can see again, the larger organizations seem to have feel more confident in terms of skills and have got resources around that. And again, that says something about whether it's a primary objective and also the capacity organizations have around that as well. But how do organisations deal with their own workforce, both paid and voluntary, then, particularly given the challenges we've talked about with the cost of living crisis, and obviously returned after COVID, and organisations feeling often very stretched, with particularly, as Jack's indicated, the demand going up within organisations as well. So lots of organisations are using flexible forms of work and different development opportunities. Just over half are using pay rises to try to tackle the cost of living, but of course some of that might be challenging due to contracts and other aspects of that as well, and attempts at socialisation opportunities. So as we live in a world where people are working remotely more often, then some of those are interesting challenges, and then attempts at wellbeing training as well. And a few organisations are using extra paid off to be able to volunteer. I suppose whether it, then again, seeing that whether the organisations treat that as one of their primary objectives, and again, this isn't surprising on one hand, but those that see it as a primary objective are also bringing that into how they organise themselves and their staff and things as well. Half organisations say they don't have the resources to support well-being. So I think this is something quite important here around whether they've got the capacity or the resources to be able to do it. So there seems to be a willingness, but do organisations have the resources to be able to do this? Which is why we're one part quite delighted to be able to have Ingrid on the call to be able to talk through some of the ways and some of the potential opportunities for that. You can see the difference there between paid staff and volunteers. So a particular challenge there for supporting volunteers around a variety of different aspects there. And again, the capacity to be able to provide different types of support, anything from eye tests and flu vaccinations to covering expenses, social activities, etc. So there's a range of different processes that organisations try to use to support their staff and their volunteers. And some of them, of course, are sort of quite stark ones, like flexible working, much more in terms of the staff than there is for volunteers. Obviously, things like expenses are really important when we're in a cost of living crisis, and the challenges that volunteers might be facing for their own financial situation, then the ability to cover expenses. But of course, as ever, then there are cost implications for organisations themselves in how they go about doing that. One of the findings then is around for the paid staff. At least 1 in 5 organisations reported an increase in burnout and leavism amongst paid staff, and 1 in 3 reported an increase in cost of living struggles. So you can see there which ones are sort of the aspects that are increasing around low well-being. Some organisations reported people resigning due to well-being. Quite a significant level of organisations reporting burnout, and unsurprisingly, I think, given the rather gloomy economic context that Jack started us with, the cost of living struggles, obviously with rent and mortgage rises and food costs, etc., then there are significant challenges there. So whilst we've seen an increase in paid staff across the sector, also there are some concerns there around turnover issues as well. People struggling with things around caring responsibilities and sickness and things as well are sort of reasonably high in that regard. And volunteering gives a little bit more stable picture, it seems to us there. So majority of those, it's talking about things staying the same, but again we have got some increases, particularly again unsurprisingly I think, given the economic context, about the cost of living struggles are quite high there. But there are some concerns there around burnout and low well-being, and again absence and those types of issues. But you have seen some things improving slightly in that picture, so it's a bit of a more mixed picture, it seems, in terms of volunteers as well. I'm going to hand over to Ingrid, who's going to talk us through a little bit more around the sort of ideas about, well, what do we do in this sort of context? And then what we want to do after Ingrid speaks, I'm going to just talk briefly around the dashboard that I put a link to in the chat, just to remind you of that, and then open it up for dialogue, I think, as well as a question and answer, and whether these, whether what we've talked about sort of matches people's experiences as well. Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Dan, and please holler if you can't see my slides, but hopefully you can see them. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about well-being more generally and try and answer some of the questions that we think have come up through the survey responses. And I want to reiterate, like Dan and Jack, thank you so much for filling in these surveys. If you don't fill in these surveys, we don't know what the problems are, and so we can't respond. So that's really important for us. So thank you. But it is a really ambitious bit of this survey, I think, because we wanted to understand everything about well-being. We wanted to understand where well-being sat in your organization in terms of your objectives, how you considered well-being of service users and communities, how you considered well-being of staff and volunteers, whether you felt confident measuring and evaluating well-being, all kinds of different things. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I will list a number of resources that you might want to go away and think about later and look up later. So the first thing to say is I'm from the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, so we're an independent organisation that brings together evidence. So we bring together evidence that's published in academic journals, that's developed through evaluations, that's published from all kinds of organizations. We bring it all together and we share it in useful ways for the people who are making decisions. So that can be government, that can be businesses, that can be charities, anybody who needs to know what works to improve well-being and how something works and who it works for and in what contexts. Those are our audiences. So we work with a number of organizations, lots of universities, lots of decision makers, and we also host the campaign to end loneliness. So if loneliness is a particular interest of yours, we have a lot of, so the campaign is part of the centre. So our research covers a number of different things because so many things affect well-being. But for example, we look at different sectors and activities, arts, culture, loneliness, physical activity. We look at some specific things, like we ask questions like, what is the difference that community buildings, community centres, community hubs make on community well-being? So we have evidence that looks at specific questions. We look at different types of measures like social capital, so sense of belonging and trust and cohesion and social support. And then we look at well-being in really tricky situations. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment on well-being at the end of life and how workplaces can support staff with terminal illness. And then we do a lot of the geeky stuff. We look at cost effectiveness and methodology to improve our understanding of well-being. And so I'm just going to make sure that everybody's on the same page about when we talk about well-being, what do we mean? So the first thing to say is that well-being is a very broad concept. When we talk about well-being, we talk about how we're doing. as individuals, as communities, and as a nation, and how sustainable this is for the future. So this is a very big holistic understanding of well-being. Some people might think that well-being actually means something a bit closer to mental health. When we use it, and when government departments or trusts and foundations use it, they generally mean this definition. So it's a much more holistic definition of how somebody is doing or how a community is doing. And well-being has been part of especially government and trust and foundation agendas for over a decade. And so you'll see a lot of charities thinking about well-being as a core outcome, partly because they're being encouraged to do so by a kind of a national conversation about well-being. So when we see small charities saying that well-being is not an objective, I think it's just that it's not a specific objective. I think actually a lot of the work that they do improves well-being. They're just maybe not thinking about it in well-being terms. That's my sense from the findings. But well-being is personal and it's subjective. It's about how we feel in ourselves and how we experience our life, but it's also how external conditions affect that feeling and affect our ability to function. And it's different for different people, and it changes over time. And because of this, we can't look at someone's life from the outside and say that person has high well-being, that person has low well-being. We have to ask people themselves to tell us in their own words how they're feeling. So it's a very personal and subjective experience. And lots of things affect well-being. The most important things that affect well-being are our health, including mental health and including changes to our health, work, and especially unemployment. Unemployment is one of the worst things that can happen for somebody's well-being, especially if it's a very long-term unemployment. But even if you have work, good quality job, and a sense of purpose at work are really important, and we'll come to that in a minute. Relationships are absolutely key to well-being, especially close family support, but also friendships and whether people feel lonely. And at work, relationships are also crucial. Lots of other things are important to well-being. The ones I want to mention on this list are income. Income affects different people differently, but low income and debt are the things that really, take a dent to well-being. But the things we do every day in our leisure time and how we use our time outside of work and outside of family are really important for well-being, and this is where volunteering comes in. But lots of things matter for well-being, and I think it's important to think about these when you think about whose well-being you want to change and how. As I said, in this country, we've been measuring well-being for a long time because governments have had a mission to improve well-being for a long time. And this is the dashboard in the Office for National Statistics, which tracks well-being across the country and reports on it at the same rate as they report on GDP. So if you think of GDP as our financial, our measure of growth as a success for this country, well-being is measured at the same time, at the same frequency in this country. And you can see your well-being of your local area by local authority and various other ways of cutting the data. And so who has the lowest well-being according to this data? So the people who are most likely to have low well-being have bad health, are economically inactive, particularly because of an illness or disability, are in middle age, are single, they rent rather than own, and they have no or basic education. And you can see that some of these things we talked about before as being the things that matter to well-being, and therefore the things that if you have less of them, or if you have a moment where something changes in your health or in your financial situation, it can take a dent to your well-being. The other thing I want to mention is that well-being changes over our life course. And what I'm showing you now is the changes we see in well-being according to different ages. And what you will see is a midlife dip. And this is something you might recognize yourself, but this is also something you might see in your staff. Most people who will be working for you or with you will be in this period of time where lots of different things are affecting your well-being, whether that's mortgages, debt, divorce, family breakdown, caring responsibilities, financial problems, all kinds of things cluster around midlife, which have an effect on well-being, which might be separate from anything to do with work, but you can see that it's reflected in the population as a whole. Volunteers who still tend to be in the older age bracket have been protected a little bit from those things. Our well-being tends to improve slightly after retirement, but actually those populations have also seen a dip in well-being as a result of the pandemic, and might be also a reluctance to come back to volunteering. So you can see how you can use the data to better understand how well-being is driving some of the behaviours that you've seen at work and in your charities. So how can we understand well-being? And I want to just divide this into generating evidence and using evidence. And you might be able to do one or both. Some people might not be able to do either of them, but actually I think almost everybody can do a little bit of at least one of these. So let's talk about measuring well-being. So I run, whole day workshops on measuring well-being, so I'm not going to go into it, but we've developed an online guide on how to create a well-being impact evaluation. So it's a step-by-step guide that takes you through what you need to think about when you're developing your well-being evaluation. That's the address. You can work through it at your own pace, and it's got lots of different sections, both on quantitative data, qualitative data, how to think about a research question, how to understand and interpret your results, lots of things in there. And so it goes through all of these steps. And at the end, there's a well-being measures bank, which is often the thing that people really want to know about. They want to know, what's the measure? What's the question I need to put in my survey to measure well-being? We've got those there. But if you go through them step by step, you understand why you're choosing different measures for different purposes. So I encourage you to do that. And we also have examples of well-being evaluations, so you can see what other people have done and how other people have approached this. So Community Connectors, which is the Sefton CVS program from a few years ago now, we have an evaluation of their stuff. New Note Orchestra is a project that works with music for people recovering from addiction. We have case studies about things like Street Games, who are, apart from anything else, are a network of organizations that work with young people and physical activity. And so if you look at our practice example library, you can see examples of what a well-being evaluation looks like and what it can tell you. But how else can you know that you're making a difference? If you can't do a well-being evaluation because of the things that Dan mentioned, like cost or skills and knowledge, there are lots of things you can still do without doing evaluations. The first thing is to use existing data, like the data from the ONS, to understand how well-being is in your area. Who's doing well, who's not doing so well, and how you can target and check that you're reaching the right people. So that's the other thing to check. Even if you just capture information about service users' age, or whether they live on their own or whether they're employed, it already tells you a lot about their risk of having low well-being. Think about those drivers of well-being, what matters to well-being, and think about which ones you can make a difference in, because it's not going to be all of them, but it might be several more than you think you can. And then look at the evidence of what works when you design activities. And I am absolutely blown away. I'm not actually massively surprised, but I'm so delighted that we've now got data that says that almost 20% of you use evidence to design your activities, because that's exactly what we want. When your GP prescribes you medication, they're not doing an evaluation of how well that medication is working every time they do that. What they do is they use the evidence of what works in terms of that medication and prescribe it in the right way. And I think if you think about using evidence in that way, that can help you kind of draw out some of the things in your activities that are really making a difference. And the other thing to do is put together a story of change. So sit down and think about, how is it that we think we're making a difference in people's lives? What are the kind of mechanisms? What are the key ingredients that are helping us make a difference to well-being? Putting that together in a logical way, I think, can really help you design good projects and activities. I just want to briefly mention volunteering and well-being. As Dan said, there's loads and loads of evidence that links volunteering with well-being outcome. And one of the things we did a couple of years ago is we did a big review of the evidence to look at this. So we looked through over 17,000 studies that were about volunteering and how it related to well-being. And when we looked at the well-being outcomes, we found all kinds of positive relationships, like higher well-being and health, an increased sense of purpose and belonging, reduced depression and anxiety, reduced loneliness. So volunteering seemed to have loads of really positive effects across the board. One of the things we found that's really important is that it can buffer the effect of life transition. So when we know that, for example, when somebody is diagnosed with an illness, or when somebody has to leave work, or because of, for example, retirement, that can be a risky moment in their life in terms of well-being. Volunteering can buffer against those effects. So it seems to act like that. We think that people with low well-being seem to benefit the most from volunteering, which is really important. But unfortunately, the people who could benefit the most face the biggest barriers to volunteering. So that's a big challenge for the sector. And all of these things are only good for well-being if the volunteering experience is positive. So if people feel valued, if they're in the right volunteer role for the right amount of time, doing the right kinds of things, and getting those kind of benefits from the experience. And one of the things we did is we created a theory of change for volunteer well-being. And you can look at this and say, what do we think we are offering volunteers? Are we maybe offering, are they getting well-being benefits from, for example, using their skills and experience? Or do they really like feeling appreciated? Can we boost that kind of volunteer appreciation activities? Is there something about the way that we design the role that might have a negative effect, like stress, exhaustion, and burnout? So this is how a theory of change, which brings together all the evidence, can help you improve your volunteer offer, I think. And now moving on to staff well-being. Lots of people are struggling, and as Jack says, that's the case across, I think, all working staff. But there are some things that that you can think about in terms of well-being at work that might be useful for you. The first thing is that, as well as all the things that affect well-being, our well-being as individuals across our whole lives, there are some things that are particular drivers of workplace well-being. And these are health and relationships, environment, purpose, and security. And we've got a lot of information about this, which I'll link to. But this basically says all of these things matter at work, but not all work is the same. And so what you want to look at, what you want to do is you want to look at the employment offer that you have and the types of work that your colleagues do, and say, what is making the biggest difference for people, and where might be seeing drivers of well-being, or also places where low well-being is being is a risk because of the way that we are offering work. So the first thing to say is that we need to feel supported and connected, and this is where health and relationships as drivers come in. This is about having an employer that supports our health, our ability to recover from health conditions, but also health promotion. So not waiting until people are sick, but encouraging people to have a healthy lives at work. Relationships matter a huge amount at work, especially with your line manager. Some of the data we find that some of the worst feelings that people have every day is when they talk to their line manager. So getting that relationship right is really important, but having supportive colleagues is also crucial. We need to feel safe, and we need to feel like we belong. So if you have staff that are out on the road, visiting service users or carrying out activities in specific settings, safety is really important, and security. But the environment at work is really important. The work occupational culture, how people feel when they come into the office, or how they feel connected if they're working remotely. And we need to feel fulfilled. And as a sector, the charity sector, we do that really well. Lots of people are really driven by a sense of purpose. But I think this is where some of the pitfalls come in, because our sense of purpose carries us through really high intensive situations where there is little money, but there's a lot to do, and that can lead to burnout. So we need to make sure that that's balanced with other things. So good jobs that lead to high well-being tend to give staff some of these things: control over their work, variety, ability to kind of progress and develop their skills, supportive relationships, including with managers, and feeling valued. So there's lots of things that I think can make a difference to someone's work. And the other thing that I actually just added this slide when Jack was talking, because Jack, you mentioned a situation where people feel like we've just started to recover from some of the effects of the pandemic, but actually there's still a lot of things that seem to be going wrong for some charities, and you want to work out where you are in this journey of recovery, prevention and promotion. Are you really still focusing on staff who need rescuing, who are at a crisis or burnout point? Or are you working to support people who might have kind of middling well-being, but actually it could get worse if we don't provide the right support, or kind of something else changes? Or are you thriving now? Have you settled into have you learned from some things that have worked well for you and for your staff, and is that what you're focusing on, promoting those things that you know work for well-being? So it's about targeting resources at the right stage. And I want you to think about where to focus your efforts. So how can you boost well-being, but also how can you buffer some of those things that are happening in people's lives that might be affecting their well-being outside of work, like the cost of living? Even if you can't give people a pay rise, which lots of people in the charity sector can't do, there are other things that you can do. And I think the two things that are really important here are, think about the balance of work. Especially for the charity sector, we do have a problem with balancing purpose versus burnout. Purpose really drives a lot of the well-being for charity workers, but it does put us at risk of burnout. And when in doubt, focus on relationships. Invest in relationships with managers and with colleagues. That will never be money wasted. That will never be effort wasted. Having positive relationships at work can make a really big difference to how people feel. We have a number of resources about measuring staff well-being, including a snapshot survey that gives you some questions that you might want to put in annual surveys, but also it can help you understand where you are now and where you want to get to. So we've got a resource which we actually developed for schools and colleges, but actually a lot of the stuff that's in there is relevant for other workplaces. So I'll share a link to that as well. And I just want to leave you with a few things to think about. So the first thing to think about is, think about who you work with and what matters to them. What are their individual circumstances and what might be putting particular pressure on their well-being? What can you control and what can't you control? Because you're not going to be able to fix everything in somebody's life, but there are probably some things that you're really, really good and really well placed at improving. And none of us do this on our own. The charity sector is very interconnected. Who else is working alongside you? What does the local puzzle look like in terms of supporting the well-being of people in a community? What does your story of change look like? What are you trying to improve? And therefore, what are the ways that you'll be able to improve well-being? How can you understand your impact better, which might not mean doing an evaluation, but I really encourage you to look at the existing evidence and read through some of our briefings to think about how you might tweak your activities to give them a well-being boost. Thank you.
So I think we're pretty much up against time, but thank you very much for everybody for, again, participating in this, for the comments and things in the chat. There's a huge number of resources that have been put along the side. We've also got the dashboard that's there, the report that's come out from PBE today as well. Please look at that. There's lots of good evidence and material within that as well. And thank you again for participating in this. We hope these sort of sessions are useful. We're experimenting as we're going along to find out what works and what is a good way of doing this, and bringing in expertise like Ingrid as well. So we hope that those sort of aspects of this are useful. So please feel free to give us some feedback about that, because we're always looking to develop and improve as well. And yeah, we'll keep in touch with you around that. So thank you so much, and we'd like to carry on these conversations. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
See where you are in the big picture. Stay ahead of the curve. Join a community of changemakers. Amplify your voice. Drive collaboration and innovation. Sign up for the survey. Have your say. And influence action where it counts. For you. Your input matters.